Before we get into rebranding, I definitely think you made a really important point, because as a trademark lawyer, of course, people come to me with either their business name, their brand name, a logo or a slogan or a tagline, and it's something that they're very, very emotionally attached to. And so, I would say that a chunk of people, not everyone, not 100%, do know that the most important thing to do in order to protect that asset that they're so emotionally attached to is to, look for a trademark. Because in the US anyway, I mean, I know that you're not here, but I know that you have laws that basically do the equivalent for you there.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the most important way to secure and protect it in the long run. It's sort of like insurance for your business name or your logo.
Yeah.
And so I always wonder how many branding agencies or, designers like yourself who help people with this entire concept, are you guys giving, you in your case, do you give some kind of even general instruction or direction at the end of the process, at the end of the journey, that says, if you want to protect it, this is the way to protect it, because it's long-term, it's in long-term, it's an investment, but it's insurance for what we've just created for you.
Yeah. I tend to discuss it at the start, because there's no point in me going and designing a brand identity or a logo called something, and then we finish it and then they go and check it and it's already taken, because then we have to start again. And I mean, I'll be honest, I've been doing this for 22 years, but in my first years I didn't look up trademarking or anything like that. I think it's as you grow in experience and you start to understand the depth of how important branding is, that you start to look wider than just what you're producing for the client. And you start to go, okay, well, where's this going to get used? I even ask things like, are you just going to be in the UK, or are you looking to be global? Because if you want to go global, then you'll need to trademark out with, not just in the UK. And you may find that if you look for a UK trademark, you can get it. But if you then go to Europe, it might be taken in Europe. You would know if it was a global one, because then it would probably be trademarked in the UK as well. But I've had instances where, I've seen people who have got the UK one, then they want to do trade in Europe, but it's already trademarked in Germany. And I know every country's, I'm do not have an in-depth database knowledge of trademarking, but I know enough that when I'm working on concept designs, before I present it to the client, I do an image search check on the WIPO website, because that's really cool, because it can look at the shape. Again, that's why I do it in black. It looks at the shape and it will look for the closest matches, but you can choose whether you want to search by concept or by shape, which is really clever, because it will show things which are pretty close, but they're not quite the same. And here's a question for yourself, because I just want to check that my understanding in its most base terms of trademarking, how it was described to me was that in its basest terms, trademarking is common sense. Does this logo make me think that I'm buying from a different business than I think it is? If you know what I mean. So it might be two fast food chains. One's been around for a while, and then somebody else starts up and does a logo which is very similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's enough that at a quick glance, let's say it was a big yellow W instead of a big yellow M, and you just see the big yellow in the curves and you go, oh, and go in and buy. That's too close. But if the big yellow W was selling motor cars, it's a totally different industry. So my understanding was that if it's a completely different industry and there's no chance of mistaking a product, that's in its basis terms. Is that correct? Ish.
Yeah, ish. Yeah. In the US, yes, it is a likelihood of confusion test. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because that is one of the most difficult issues to overcome once you do receive it. And so it's better to understand that main issue when you're entering into this whole process. But yeah, that's basically the gist of it, is the reason that two brands with the same name, like Dove, two completely different products. You have Dove soap, Dove body wash, hair care products, and then you have Dove chocolate. And the reason those two are able to coexist is because, nobody's really going to think that Dove chocolate, is, I mean,
you're not going to be washing your hair with it. Yeah.
With chocolate, right. I mean, if Dove Body Care came out with chocolate body wash, then I asked myself, would that cause some kind of...
That's the thing, isn't it? It's like initially there is no crossover, but then where does that, because I think there was, I do follow certain things. I think there was I think the most recent Formula One racing logo looked very similar to, I think it was a 3M product. Mm-hmm. And so there was a whole hoo-ha about that, about whether that would go. And now it's F1, so they've just spent millions on doing this up, and you think, well, surely the agency that was designing that will have checked to see if it's close to anything. And so my assumption would be that they would be under the same, I think the bigger agency, the massive agencies like Pentagram who do these big things, I'd imagine they would have IP experts on staff, or at least on retainer, that they can say, could you go check that? And not just some junior designer who says, oh yeah, no, 3M's in an entirely different industry, we'll be fine.
I think that, immediately what comes to mind are two things. One is that the company is such a giant that they don't really care if they're stepping on any toes. They just don't care. I'm big enough to pay off whoever it is that's already using it. If it's going to cost me another $1 million, I don't care, because in the long run, I stand to make, $1 billion. So that's one approach that maybe that they might be thinking about. And the other one is attention. Sometimes the attention that's brought to a company is more than what they could pay for through any type of public relations campaign, or media marketing campaign, advertising. And so just the attention that's brought to a company in that process, you heard about it, right?
Yeah. I suppose in a way, if you could play it that way, and you could deliberately design a logo which is very similar to someone else's, knowing that you are going to get sued for it, but in the background have a logo ready to replace it.
Exactly.
People are now very aware of who you are, so they'll follow the story. And when you change your logo, I suppose there is something like that. I've got another question for you, actually. It's something which cropped up with me. And that was, I'd created a logo concept for a client. And when I did a WIPO check, a concept came up, and it was pretty much exactly what I designed. And that's the problem with when you're creating logos, the more simple the shape, the more chance that it's been done before. You think about the number of logos that are in the world, any that are made up from simple shapes or forms are more than likely going to have been done before. I've actually got a book right behind me, which is about the size of me. It's huge. But these are logos from the sort of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And when you look through here, so for example, the Airbnb logo is in here, but it's like a Japanese steel company from like the 1960s. So nothing is new. Stuff's always been done before. And so my question was this: the concept that was on the WIPO was for a company, and it was no longer trading, basically meaning that it had lapsed. So because I think you have to renew is it 20 years?
In the US, it's every 5th to 6th year you have to renew it, and then on the 10th year.
Right. Okay. So this one had obviously it had not been renewed, so it said it was lapsed. So my question is, would I have been able to forge ahead with the concept I'd created? Now, they weren't even in the same industry, but even let's say they were in the same industry, and I go, oh, I've created this concept. I haven't copied that. This has come out of, I can show the whole strategy and where this has come from. We want to trademark this. It's already been trademarked, but that looks to have, they've not renewed it. So it doesn't look like the company's even around anymore. Would you be able to trademark a logo which had been trademarked before, but is no longer active? That's it. Inactive. That's what it said. Inactive.
Inactive. Well, that's a really, really good question, because here, we refer to them as dead. So,
that's pretty final.
Yeah. So dead or inactive, you're essentially looking at the same type of situation. And if something is dead, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not in use, which is the most important thing. It's the bottom line. It's the question you should be asking yourself instead of focusing on what the status is. Because it's not necessarily the status, it's the foundational question, is this still in use? So if there's a way for you to find that out, either by doing a Google search, by maybe calling the company, then I think that is the safest bet. Because let's say somebody simply forgot to renew it, then it could have lapsed. It could show as dead. Let's say they just didn't have the money to renew it because now they've downsized substantially from the large company they used to be. They're still going to be using it and they still have trademark rights in the name.
Yeah, because they've got years behind them of trading off of that identity.
Exactly. And I've seen that happen where they still send cease and desist letters despite not having an active or trademark registration that's alive.
Yeah.
So that's what it comes down to, is don't focus on the wording, just focus on the foundational question, is it still in use? And if you can find an answer to that question or get you closer to an answer, then I think you'd be warmer.
Yeah, I think for me, if I created a concept that was exactly the same or very close to a concept in the same industry, I would go back to the drawing board. I wouldn't want to, because there would be too much confusion from the customer's point of view of, oh, is that them again, but they're doing something slightly different in the same industry. If it was for an entirely different industry, so one was steel making and the other one was cheese making, then I may want to look at pursuing, and I would do the groundwork that you mentioned to see. But I know that there are kind of brands out there that do have very similar logos that, you know, for example, Converse use a star. You've got, there's a beer brand, I think it's Estrella or something, they use a star. There's lots of businesses or brands that use stars, but they're in different industries, and so they kind of get away with it. And the same color as well, so a red star. Yeah, what you said earlier about the confusion thing, you know, is the customer going to be confused between these two? So I have clients who are going through a branding process who've never done that before, and their head's already exploding. And so the last thing I want to do is to bring in terminology about trademarking that confuses them even more. So I'm trying to make sure that I can have the simplest message and say, look, here's what trademarking essentially boils down to. Is this going to confuse a customer, making them think it's someone else's product in the same industry? I think that's fine for me. But yeah, like I say, I generally will look, if it's a name, it's so much easier to check if it's a name. When it's an icon or a symbol, there's a little bit more work. And I do say to the client that, you know, I've done some due diligence, but I cannot guarantee that it doesn't exist in some trademarking book or database somewhere that I've just not had access to. So I can guarantee that the work I'm producing for you is original in concept from what I've created. But if you want to go and trademark it, then I can't guarantee. There's no guarantees because there's so many logos out there. And so I always advise that they go and speak to an IP lawyer, depending on which country they're in, you know, go and speak to their and check their different intellectual property office. I think the States is the UPTO.
USPTO.
USPTO, yeah. And it's the IPO here. But I use the WIPO because it tends to link into quite a few databases. I think it's getting easier these days to do checks like that. I think in the past, before the internet, I must just be going through books.
Yeah.
Trying to see, you know, so I can understand why fees can be potentially quite large if you've got to do an image search. That's a much more difficult one than doing a name search.